the US and the Western allies are in a green zone, secluded from the rest of society, isolated in a green zone, while Iran is in society, infiltrating across. While the US is trying to develop this coalition provisional authority and setting up these structures of what a government should look like, Iran is dealing with realities and facts on the ground.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, we have something special for you. On March 4th, I spoke with two old friends in the CSIS studio about the resilience of Iranian networks in the Middle East. Dr. Renad Mansour had just co-written a paper on the topic for Chatham House, where he's a senior research fellow and director of the Iraq Initiative. Dr. Sanam Vakil leads Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. She's a noted expert on Iran, with whom I co-wrote an article for Foreign Affairs last summer. There's a video of our conversation on the CSIS website if you'd like to watch it, but we also wanted to have it available to you as a podcast if that's the way you prefer to digest information. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. So Sanam, Renad, welcome to Babel.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So Renad, what's the thesis of this paper you wrote?
So the research puzzle that we're looking to address in this is how Iran and its networks have historically adapted and how the configurations that we see in the last few years will sort of transpire.
And these are networks that reach throughout the Middle East.
Yes, so it's part of a project, accept cross-border conflict evidence policy and trade funded by UK Development, which looks at transnational conflict to make the point that we can't take a country-specific approach when responding to conflict. And in this case study, we wanted to look at Iran and its networks, known, sometimes as the axis of resistance, groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon until the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, the PMF, many different popular mobilization forces groups in Iraq, of course, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iran sort of as, for a long time, the leader of this group. But we know, as we say in the paper, that's also changing.
Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Yes. And we get through the
groups.
history of this, especially Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We looked at the history of this because 2024 was a very bad year for Iran and this axis of resistance. Since October 7th, several of these groups, Hezbollah, of course, Hamas on October 7th, have been at war with Israel, and Israel has launched a sort of transnational war, attacking many of these groups in Gaza, elsewhere, West Bank, and Lebanon. The policy thesis at this moment in 2025 is Iran is on the back foot. It's potentially at its weakest point in the region since the Islamic Revolution. So we went back to understand how Iran would respond to such setbacks. And following the Islamic Revolution in 1979, a year later, 1980, Saddam invaded Iran. Since then, Iran has gone through military shocks, political shocks, economic shocks, and it's always managed, for survival reasons, to reconfigure. Our assumption is this will happen again.
What's the power of networks in responding to those kinds of shocks? What makes networks more resilient than other kinds of security arrangements?
We looked at two specific supply chains to get a glimpse into how this reconfiguration is playing out today. We looked at the energy market, so Iran's continued exports of fuel products, oil, as well as financial flows. What we saw are exactly these networks. But these networks aren't just business people making money. These are networks that span across formal and informal economies, licit and illicit economies. Also, other countries in the Gulf, for example, that are very much part of these supply chains, and expands globally, China, Russia, and others. These are networks that are fluid. What that allows is when one part of that network is being attacked or removed, in the case of Assad's regime in Syria, the networks could reconfigure. And what we've seen, an example of this is with Hezbollah weakened in Lebanon and the Assad regime removed in Syria, other parts of that network, the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Iraq, have increased their relationship with each other and taken a bigger role in this. When we used to meet the Houthi leader in Baghdad, the representative, He didn't have much to do. It was a very formal, but not a very existent relationship. That's completely changed. That's the argument that the paper makes, is looking at these supply chains, we understand that Iran and its networks are able to move across state, non-state lines, across formal, informal lines, but also across lines of who are allies and adversaries of Western countries, allowing it to take advantage of this multi-aligned moment in the region where there aren't rigid spheres of influence dictating global order. And in this transition, we think, therefore, Iran is already beginning to reconfigure following a year or two of significant setbacks.
So let me bring Sanam into this conversation. Did Iran start off thinking that it was going to build a set of regional partners, that it was going to create a network? Was that sort of embedded in the revolution, embedded in some sort of Shia connection to other folks? Was it something that over time, the Iranian government said, this seems to work, let's keep doing it?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a strategy in a box configured by revolutionary elites in 1979. Iran has operated quite opportunistically, taking advantage of conflicts in weak states across the Middle East. And it began first in the case of Lebanon, where it did have ties with Lebanese groups on the ground. Iranian revolutionaries were training with Palestinians and with Lebanese, and so they knew each other. In the context of the Lebanese civil war, there was an opportunity to help support the birth of Hezbollah effectively. And those relationships were built over time. Hezbollah and Iran know each other very well, and they've grown organically as stronger, brothers, as they would call it. Iran has oftentimes been perceived to be commanding and controlling, let's say, a Hezbollah or the other Axis groups in the region. And that's not quite right. What Iran oftentimes does is allow these groups to flourish in their own domestic theaters. And so they have agency in the relationships. What Iran has sought in this model is, of course, to project power and strength beyond its borders, closer to its perceived threats. And in this case, it's Israel, but also to help support these groups become part of the political establishment in the countries that they operate. This is tied to Iran's worldview and thinking, because the Iranian revolution gave birth to an Islamic republic that was isolated. Over time, it built relationships with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis through the context of the late 1990s and 2000s in Yemen. Assad and Iran go back to 1979. But of course, the relationship took a particular turn through the Arab uprisings and the Syrian war. And that led Iran to be further embedded in the Syrian state.
In terms of the growth of these networks, was that despite Western efforts to constrain the growth of the networks? Or was there not sufficient Western effort? Because not all of them are proxies. Some of them are proxies. Some of them are client groups.
For these networks to be strong, they need to be self-sustaining. They all need to have both local power and transnational power. Because the system that we're describing has a logic to itself. There used to be this metaphor used, the octopus with the tentacles. Qasem Soleimani at the time, or Iran, would be the head, and then the different groups would be sort of in this top-down structure, pursuing Iran's policy while also pursuing their own policies. What we've seen, particularly since the U.S. killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in 2020, is a much more horizontal model. Each group has to have their own agency, has to have their own autonomy. They need to be in local governments. The local is really important to this. That allows for the transnational. What we're describing in this paper is a geo-economic system that is a response to Western policies, for example, sanctions. Crucial to that is all these groups have to have state and non-state power at the local level.
It feels to me, as I was reading the paper and thinking back to watching The Sopranos twice, that this feels a lot like an organized crime group. It feels it's a lot about money laundering. It's moving illicit goods across borders. It's having some self-sufficiency, but passing money up through the chain. Are there ways in which it's not accurate? Is that fundamentally what's going on?
I think, of course, part of it is the sort of economic angle. The motivation is profit. And you have these groups that are, motivated by profit. But I guess why I would push back a bit on the sort of Sopranos as this is because many of these groups also see themselves as states. Many of them ideologically see themselves as being political representatives. For example, PMF groups don't like being even referred to as militias because they see themselves as much bigger than that. They are parts of the Iraqi state. They are political. They are social. They have all of these different programs. I think what unites them and what gets into this conversation is they have impunity and there's no accountability. They're able to easily have both influence over formal state structures, governments, parliaments, local assemblies, as well as the kind of informal economies. On the point of informal economy, the more they get sanctioned, the more the informal economy grows and develops its own logic, as we've been saying. That coupled with the fact that you have markets like China and elsewhere for these commodities to go to, and this transitioning world order where there isn't a kind of unipolar or Western-driven power dynamic, means that this is becoming the norm.
Hezbollah feels to me like as it was the first major quasi-state actor, although maybe the PLO was a quasi-state actor in Jordan before. I mean, help us think through the rise of quasi-state actors in the Middle East. Is that an old phenomenon that's been reinvigorated, or is there something unique about the way Iran has promoted it?
I think Iran has looked across the region and seen the early revolutionaries were young students and protesters and watched the sort of rise and growth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Khomeini is believed to be an admirer of Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb and those sort of early sort of non-state movements also in Egypt. And I think seeing the growth of non-state actors as a means to assert influence against a weak state is definitely appealing. I think also looking at a sort of revolutionary model like that of Iran, the base of support for, let's say, the dispossessed or the marginalized communities of the Middle East through non-state actors is also an appealing model for Iran. It very much, I think, harnessed that in the context of Lebanon in particular and took it forward. The rest of the relationships were opportunistic. Again, it wasn't a model in a box that they said, now we're going to do this in Syria and then in Iraq and then in Yemen. It benefited and capitalized, going back to your previous question, on the lack of consistency in, let's not blame the United States wholly, in Western engagement in the Middle East. When there was conflict, when there was chaos, when there was the Arab Spring, when there was the U.S. invasion in Iraq, these were opportunities for Iran to replicate not the exact model, because in each relationship, there are particularities. Iran's relationship with Iraqi groups go back to the 1970s. It goes back to the Iran-Iraq War, when Iran, in many cases, developed its network of relationships with many of Iraq's contemporary leaders by inviting them to Iran and giving them housing and a place to stay until they went back in 2003. It's just the nature of the way Iran builds relationships that's different. It's much more agile because it's an isolated state by its own making. I think it works in less traditional ways. And one of the non-traditional ways is its network building approach and its ability to use networks. And it's done so in Iran itself with the IRGC, with the Quds Force, using these small networks to build power and influence within a massive bureaucracy.
But it seems that part of the secret that you've been describing is that you have states that try to use interstate tools, and Iran operates quite vigorously on the non-state level. And states sometimes have problems reaching things on the non-state level, especially when there's not a strong state counterpart to address Western demands. Is that by design, or is that by happenstance?
So I think a big policy sort of puzzle is, for many Western states going to the Middle East, is many of these states that we're talking about don't resemble that Weberian construct where you have monopoly over legitimate violence. Many of these countries just aren't like that. The formal governments in many of these countries aren't the most powerful institutions. And a lot of social institutions or informal institutions are really governing people. That's what we're talking about. Now, if we think about the policy side of this, a big policy approach to Iran's networks that has already come back with the US President Trump administration is maximum pressure. And the idea is, how can we sanction and other tools try and degrade Iran and its allies in the region? The argument there is Iran and its allies become most vulnerable when these states are actually built where they have sovereignty, when they're able to hold to account, rather than these groups having impunity and there being chaos. The challenge, therefore, instead of attacking Iran directly through these different countries, build these states, develop the sort of infrastructures in these states so they can hold to account. Because the reality is the local is still very important. These groups, sure, they're close to Iran, and at times they have to follow Iran's orders, definitely. But that absent strong state infrastructure, Iran will always be able to use these networks to navigate policy responses.
Is there any state in the Middle East that Western countries haven't spent tens, if not hundreds, if not billions of dollars trying to strengthen, invigorate, improve governance? I mean, it seems to me that every country in the Middle East has been the target of Western efforts to build precisely what you're talking about with, I think, mixed results. Should we expect something different because of this issue, because of the focus on Iran?
The way we've been trying to think this through is there are a set of policy tools, carrots and sticks. Some of them are punitive and some of them are part of building states, certainly. The challenge has been they don't really speak to each other. Sometimes killing a senior leader or sanctioning a bank in a country could completely unravel any efforts to support civil society in that country or to support state building in that country. The kind of approach to both take punitive measures and to build states have at times been at odds with each other. Therefore, we haven't seen much success in
states that we don't have adversarial relationships with, for example, Egypt.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I did my dissertation on Egypt and American foreign assistance in the 1950s, and the United States was trying to build accountable government, greater community engagement. We have been working on the judiciary system in Egypt for decades. I mean, all these different things. We're not killing people in Egypt. The problem is if you're on the outside and you're trying to encourage good governance, and people on the inside have entire business models that are predicated on what we often from the outside look at and say is bad governance, how do you overcome that in a place like Lebanon, which has warlords who have been dominating economies for decades? How do you move off that system with 18 different sectarian groups? How do you move from a system in Yemen, which has relied on patronage networks, controlling economies and controlling security for decades? I'm not saying it's not desirable. I'm saying as a sort of immediate policy response, if you really need an outcome, can building resilient governance, improving governance from afar with people who come in for a year or two to work with people who are there for decades and decades and decades is hard.
I think there are sort of structural bureaucratic problems with this. As you say, can the US and UK really do what should be an organic, bottom-up, local process? We know that, for example, right now in Lebanon, there is an opportunity. Many Lebanese are trying to understand, is this a moment where they can build their states? There's a new government, new leadership, this attempt to maybe move past having armed groups like Hezbollah with impunity. As much as we talk about these groups being adaptable and across the region, the Iran groups, their biggest point of vulnerability is their own population. And we did focus groups across the region, speaking to people who are the social base of these groups in Iraq and Lebanon and elsewhere. The one thing they'll say is, we don't like the fact that we have these armed groups. But when we need to get something done, we go to these armed groups, right? And that is the reality. When we brainstorm policy options, what we're suggesting is there's something there. There are people in these social bases, in these countries that want something different. The question of how much and how directly externals could be involved in that process, I think is a valid question that we need to keep thinking about. The point also is some of the more punitive top-down attacks on these groups have seen a backlash in that point where the vulnerability to these regimes should be actually harnessed rather than hurt.
You know, one of the other things when I went to Iraq 5 or 10 years ago, one of the things that struck me was people noted that Iranian networks in Iraq were much more embedded than American networks in Iraq, despite the fact that the United States spent $1 trillion and supposedly focused huge amounts of governmental effort on building the kind of future for Iraq the United States wanted. And in many ways, Iraq didn't fight in the war, but it won the war in the post-Saddam environment. Why do you think Iran was so effective building its networks out through Iraqi communities, extending well beyond the Shia communities in Iraq. Why were they so good, and why are Western governments so bad?
The Iranians were very well placed. They knew Iraq very well. In the same way, let's say, that the Israelis knew Lebanon very well and hence have proven to be very effective at a military and intelligence level. Iran went through that 8-year devastating war, and then that was Iran's sort of never again moment. So when 2003 happened and the U.S. came to Iran's borders effectively, there was this moment where Iran had to recalibrate and develop a strategy that I think is worth going back to in how it worked to develop over time, not immediately, a political strategy, an economic strategy, and the networks. And they're interconnected. It has used institutional relationships to develop sort of government to government ties, a strategic framework to formalize the relationships. And at the same time, of course, it worked to destabilize the United States militarily through the presence of militias and its own presence in Iraq. Then, because of sanctions, and I think this is very important, Iran has, for well over this period of time, been working on building its resilient economy to circumvent and survive in the midst of sanctions pressure. And Iraq was a perfect place for Iranian businessmen to go in, for relationships to bear fruit. It was a bit of a process, a bit of shaping and shifting through many years. It's been bottom up very much. I'm reminded of an anecdote told to me by a Gulf policymaker who told me that he went to dinner in the Iranian embassy and was very struck about how the Iranians do diplomacy, something very nuanced. The Iranians work on the bottom up. There's no hierarchy. They're not going to just sit there. The Iranian ambassador got up, served everybody himself. There's a certain sort of personal nature to the way the Iranians do business in the region that I think is particular. Someone else also told me recently that the Iranians send him a WhatsApp message every day to see how he's doing. The networks are personal. The networks become intimate. And he said what began as a business relationship has become a friendship. That's how they work. They never leave you alone. They'll never give up on you, and they'll always come back and call in the favor, mafia style or not.
While this is happening, the US and the Western allies are in a green zone, secluded from the rest of society, isolated in a green zone, while Iran is in society, infiltrating across. While the US is trying to develop this coalition provisional authority and setting up these structures of what a government should look like, Iran is dealing with realities and facts on the ground. I think exactly that dichotomy led to Iran becoming what many Iraqis now see as the occupying force in Iraq.
Is there a way for Western governments to replicate what Iran did? Should Western governments try to? Do the Iranians have enough ways to threaten the security of Western government officials that it's not possible to do it, but Western government officials won't threaten Iranians because they play by Marquis of Queensberry rules and don't take people out? I mean, has Iran turned that to its advantage and sort of blocked Western governments from playing that role effectively?
I wouldn't make Iran 10 feet tall. I think this is important. Iran, as we have seen over the past 18 months, has been very much of a paper tiger. It's been working with asymmetrical capabilities. I think what Iran did, and I was always very struck by everyone's belief that Iran had so much power in the region, is that it had the mirage of power projection through the capabilities of these groups and through bigging up this whole axis of resistance. Regional governments, but also Western policymakers should talk to everybody, not just the partners and allies that have the shared ideological views. Something that the Iranians have implemented consistently for a number of decades now is their willingness to work with anyone. It's not necessarily a Shia crescent. It's not an ideological alliance. It's an opportunistic set of relationships that play their part depending on the regional shifts, the geopolitical shifts. Iran took in Al-Qaeda. That doesn't make sense, does it? Iran has long-standing ties with the Armenian state. So it's always trying to pragmatically orient and manage relationships. And I think this is where the West and some countries in the Middle East could do better. You should talk to all civil society groups, all political actors, and develop a better sense of what's going on in these societies rather than this sort of zero-sum binary.
Renad, do you think there are legitimate constraints to the kinds of interactions that Western officials will have in Middle Eastern countries?
I think certainly issues such as designations of terrorist groups has impeded how much the U.S. could interact with powerful actors across the Middle East. While these designations may serve a political purpose both at home and abroad, they have at times limited what Sanam is saying, which is the power of engagement. You don't have to agree, but this is a negotiation and there is a reality. In some places, the reality is that these groups are representing power. Engagement needs to always be one of the policy tools if there is to be an agenda in these countries.
It strikes me, too, that there's an issue of expectations, that people's expectations is Western governments will have huge resources and be willing to do large things, and expectations of Iranians is, well, maybe we'll just patch something up. Is there an expectation gap that has to be overcome?
Yeah, and again, to make the point that many people aren't necessarily thrilled that Iran is so powerful in their countries. In fact, across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, until the fall of Assad regime, there have been calls not just for reform, but to remove Iran. Iraqis since 2014-15 have been saying, Iran, barra, out, get out.
Yeah.
There is popular points against this. Again, I come back to this point that the elites in these countries see benefit from the relationship with Iran. It may look like Iran is a monopoly over Iraq's energy trade. That's not the case. There are people in Iraq who benefit from that specific type of arrangement, and we can go across supply chains.
Although people benefit from arrangements with the United States, with the UK, with other governments too, in many cases at larger scale.
Yes. Iran is a neighbor. Iran is integral to the supply chains across the region. That's not to say that the people in these countries don't want Western, US, and European products, supply chains, and all of this. So certainly what's being stressed across the governments in this region is we want multi-alignment. We don't want us and them anymore. We don't want East and West anymore. We want it to be okay to have relationships with Russia, with China, with Iran, and with the US and Europe.
Do you feel there are times when the Iranian willingness to break the rules are attractive to people in a way they couldn't be for Western governments, whether it's protection rackets, bribery, other kinds of things? Is that a major part of the Iranian toolkit, or is it sort of incidental in your experience?
I think it's certainly there as the nature of these illicit supply chains. This is part of the sanctions-busting economy that has developed over a number of decades. I think the ironic sort of outcome of sanctions against the Islamic Republic is that it's taken a country that has been strategically isolated in the region and it's built greater connectivity between Iran and its neighbors, obviously in malign rather than benign ways. Nevertheless, this is important. And then Iran, of course, certainly takes advantage of weak governance, weak enforcement, lax border policing, and all sorts of things in order to break the quote unquote rules.
There's this point on sort of Westphalian Western diplomacy, that the minister of a European country needs to meet with their counterpart, the minister in Iraq, for example, to sign an energy deal. The reality is, in a country like Iraq or Lebanon elsewhere, the minister isn't the most powerful person on charge of that file. Iran isn't going to only meet with that minister. Iran will understand who are the power brokers and choke points inside that ministry and be able to leverage one off of the other.
How do you do that and follow the other policy recommendation of your paper, which is improve governance, accountability, essentially strengthen the command chain inside a ministry or inside a government, while you are understanding he's the tribal leader, he's the power broker, he's the boss, he's whatever. I mean, are those in tension to build up orthodox power and to engage effectively with the people who actually have the power?
What we're arguing in the paper, the fundamental problem in these states is that these are states of impunity, which means there is not accountability, which means that these types of informal economies become normal and no one can check it. No institution can check it. Certainly, any contracts and any engagements, any trade needs to be coupled with an effort to ensure that this impunity is checked. And this, again, as we've been saying, needs to be a bottom-up focus. It should be an organic, local focus. But that's the fundamental problem, is that impunity that fuels the supply chains.
How do outside powers that have much less of an enduring stake in the trajectory of these societies shape the actions of people who have a much larger stake?
I think If we consider the trajectory going forward, I think the impulse is going to be to force people to make tough choices. I think that that's going to be a tricky approach in a region that is understanding that geography is destiny and security has to be managed in multifaceted ways. It's a harder sell to make, but rather than asking partners, be it economic or political, to pick sides, I think you have to ring fence arrangements and actually take a long-term type of engagement inside these countries, at least at a commercial level. I understand that
Help me understand what ring fencing engagements for long-term relationships looks like.
Well, if you're going to build an economic or commercial contract, have it be long-term, sustainable, endurable, obviously adaptive to the conditions on the ground, but don't just be there for a few years and leave. That's how you can be there and enforce accountability over time, but not throughout the entire system. In the case of Iraq, for example, where we can maybe imagine that maximum pressure will result in choices and pressure on the Iraqi government, how can you ask the Iraqi government to make those choices when they're existential and Iran is their neighbor? Trying to create economic arrangements that perhaps incentivize and enforce governance, but are also long-term, would be one avenue in to show consistency and accountability.
But even in friendly governments like Saudi Arabia, for example, creating accountable bureaucracies, creating that sort of accountability for outside powers is remarkably hard, because not only do they have their history, they have their futures ahead of them. And their futures are based on their long-term interests, which sometimes are not about creating the sort of Westphalian models, the sort of rules-based orders, all those things. They're based on people in power who retain power. To me, one of the challenges is this is a problem throughout the Middle East in friendly countries and in conflict-affected countries of all stripes, whether they're friendly or unfriendly. And we've been working on addressing this problem set for a long time with mixed results. In fact, it's hard for me to think of a place where we've been able to push countries over the hump. Am I missing an example of success?
No, you're not. This is where maximum pressure can have negative consequences. So if we're going into maximum enforcement of maximum pressure, the unintended consequences will take place in the countries where you do seek to push Iran out or remove Iranian influence. And that weakens civil society. That has knock-on consequences for livelihoods and thereby also for governance and accountability. So it is the unintended outcome of this persistent tension and adversarial dynamic with Iran.
So let's talk about a country that has had a persistent adversarial relationship, Israel, which in many ways treated the Hezbollah presence in Lebanon as something that was deeply threatening, but couldn't really be moved until it decided to move it. It used military means, some covert means, and Hezbollah is profoundly weaker now than it was September 1st. First, why do you think military instruments were so successful in what Israel was trying to do? And how do you think Hezbollah is likely to adapt to what Israel did to it over the last 5 months?
Military instruments have often in the short term been successful. You could remove a regime like the Saddam Hussein regime. You could remove a group like ISIS multiple times in its iterations in Iraq and Syria. You could weaken Hezbollah, certainly. The question is always, what is the political aspect that is necessary to be part of that military aspect? The assumption we have, based on sort of the work that we've done historically, is that Hezbollah at some point will have to reconstitute itself. What it comes out will be different to what it was, as you say, on September 1st. We know historically that military solutions on their own do not suffice to changing realities or facts on the ground.
Although you could argue that diplomatic solutions also, from the Israeli perspective, also don't suffice on their own. And maybe the question is, how do you artfully combine them?
With the facts on the ground very much changed in Lebanon, with a new, perhaps technocratic and more motivated Lebanese government for the first time in a long time, that's where the negotiation and the political settlement process needs to go. How it's going to get there, we don't have the answers. Is it going to be a conference? Is it going to be behind-the-scenes negotiations? And what sort of incentives are on the table to change Hezbollah's behavior? That's also going to have to be discussed and thought through. I think Hezbollah is going to focus locally. It has no choice but to do so. It has done so in the past. That is one way for Hezbollah to channel its purpose inward and deliver accountability to its own community.
Do you think the Iranians will be able to continue supplying $1 billion a year to Hezbollah, given that both Hezbollah may be more local, less opposition to Israel, and there's not that supply chain that can run through Syria, which Iran have grown very reliant on?
Yeah, I think certainly it will be reconfiguring. It's already trying to reconfigure. Obviously, the planes are not being permitted to land, and they'll be looking for new channels in. Turkey has been flagged as also trying to put blocks in. I think there has to be coordination at the international level to enforce that accountability. And it will be interesting to watch, and maybe our hypothesis is wrong, that they won't adapt and Hezbollah itself will morph into something else. There are also options here for Iran. Iran itself can adapt, because as the itinerations of the axis have changed through the years from being much more Iran managed to then becoming horizontal. Then we went through this transnational moment where they tried to coordinate all together. We don't know how the axis is going to reconfigure. Iran's certainly been debating internally how it should fortify itself in this moment of perceived, if not actual weakness, and think about what steps it needs to take. This is an opportunity also to perhaps press Iran to align its foreign and economic policies and engage in a different way across the region. That requires actually thinking about the Iranian political system, dynamics and tensions between Iranian factions, the growth and empowerment of the IRGC itself as a non-state actor within the Iranian state, and it brings up more sad complexities.
What are the policy things that Western governments can do to push Iranian networks to adapt in ways that Western governments think are more constructive? To what extent should it be clamping down on some activities, turning a blind eye to other activities, promoting some activities?
At the moment, we both believe that it's about opening Iran up rather than keeping it closed. I think we both believe that at some point engagement and reaching some kind of a deal and bringing Iran back in will allow some of these issues we've been discussing on accountability and these networks to not just become these informal, secret, illicit networks, but to sort of come in. That, I think, is where we've landed, and especially in the paper where we discussed that there needs to be engagement, and that will be felt. It's transnational because it'll be a deal on Iran, but it'll be felt in Beirut, it'll be felt in Baghdad, it'll be felt elsewhere in the region.
Yes, and it's the harder sell, of course, in the geopolitical climate. And of course, perhaps also in Iran. I think that's also to consider. Having watched Iran for many years, I continue to see sanctions as having weakened the Iranian economy, but it hasn't changed Iranian behavior. The persistent aim of containment, depending on how it's enforced, because some would contend that in different administrations, there's more containment or less containment. I think containment whole scale has enforced Iran's predatory behavior in the region rather than change in Iranian behavior. What Iran does really well is adapt, is resist, is constantly crisis manage. That's what it has been doing for 46 years. What Iran doesn't know how to do is normal. Business to business relationships, regular government to government dynamics, signing business contracts when the JCPOA was signed in 2015 took forever because there just wasn't that commercial mind muscle in the system, and it needs to learn how to be normal. And maybe normalcy, big question, will over time change the dynamics.
Renad, several times you've talked about the region's desire to be unaligned, breakdown in global order. It seems to me that the two powers that are most interested in promoting a less aligned, less ordered world are Russia and China, which keep talking about the global south, largely, to my mind, as a way to differentiate the overwhelming majority of the world's population, a growing percentage of the world's economic activity, isolated from the West and aligned with them. It seems to me that their interest is in keeping Iran as an outlier, to keep the region in some level of churn, not too much churn that it might negatively affect their interests, but enough churn to create enduring tensions for Western countries, to keep countries from falling into Western paradigms. If the Russians and the Chinese are constantly trying to feed elements of informality, instability, lack of accountability, because they see that world is threatening, how should Western countries respond to that?
I would first say that this idea of multi-alignment or not being aligned isn't just being now pushed by Russia, China. You see it across the region, across the Gulf even. I mean, Gulf countries have come a very long way. Just a decade ago, there was no relationship even with Baghdad because they thought Iraq was lost to Iran after 2003. Since then, both on the economic file, you've seen much more greater linkages with both Iran and Iraq. Even politically now, Gulf diplomats and representatives are saying, we want multi-alignment. This is just the reality. We're talking about a completely different space where it's not just Russia and China, but it's even, as I say, traditional allies of the US and the West that are saying, we are seeing something different. We live it. This is the region we're living in, and this is what we're seeing, and we need to adapt to it. Multi-alignment is here.
My point is, if we're talking about formality and accountability and transparency and all the kinds of things that represent good governance, and Russia and China have an interest in keeping countries from drifting into that category because they are comfortable with informality, they are comfortable with lack of transparency and accountability. They're very comfortable with a region that continues to distract Western powers from activities containing Russia and China. How do you create order when there's somebody who's actually encouraging a country like Iran to challenge the kinds of trajectory that you're trying to encourage, and they would like Iran to continue to keep the Middle East in a certain amount of churn?
The issue isn't formal versus informal. Many people in the region, when they see a truck driving by, there's less of an issue. Is this formal? Is this not formal? The first issue is, are these systems responsive to the needs of the population? The assumption is, too, if these systems are more accountable, they're more likely to have to be responsive. So whether China and Russia prefer or work in informal sectors is one thing. I think the pushback on this point would be the people don't want this. That's what we continue to stress. How can policies, A, do no harm, and 2, if possible, and it's a big if, support the people in their demands for the economic processes that we see to trickle down to actually support their needs rather than any sort of external or transnational need?
It's hard. I mean, I think it's been hard to get people to support good governance because what we've seen in Lebanon and certainly in post-war Iraq has been good governance is lovely in the long term, but right now I need something and I need an address and I need somebody who can get it for me quickly.
Then basically, should there be a long-term strategy or not? Because what we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere is exactly what you're saying is, I need something done today. I'm in Baghdad. I'm ambassador only for 2 years. I need a win. It needs to be a longer term. There needs to be something institutionally reconfigured to say, yes, we can get the little wins, but how are these little wins that we need sort of taking us to an end state? That coherent strategic thinking has been lost because of the churn of this diplomacy.
I would also say that there's an opportunity as governments are overstretched and bandwidth is an issue, to work more robustly with the private sector. Private sector relationships across the Middle East have been very important for the United States and other countries. Empowering the private sector a bit more to build the longer-term sustainable relationships, not just with the oil companies, but bringing others in, is another avenue that can lead to the long-term sustainability. But I'm conscious that this is a hard ask. Ultimately, for the region, governance and accountability has to come from below. In the context of conflict, geopolitical competition, and bandwidth, and the need for quick wins, the below processes are completely neglected and abandoned. This is just about perpetuating elites, ultimately, at the end of the day. The policies are ultimately going to cause tumult for these elites. That's where we're going in the next few months or forward.
You've talked about how this is a network of networks, and the reason it's so resilient and adaptive is because it is a network of networks. It seems to me that the private sector, the business community, is the ultimate network of networks. There are rules. Is there something that Western governments should be doing to enhance the network capacity of the private sector that would move the policy issues in a really decisive direction that they haven't been doing?
I think the United States under the Biden administration started the ball a little bit by trying to put forward ideas about a broader regional corridors and connectivities. That's one strategy about outsourcing, bringing the private sector in, and creating a broader network of players. It will be interesting to see if that approach is taken forward. It's hard to immediately see that developing in the climate of conflict. We're in a really embedded period, and we have to overcome this conflict for those relationships to develop. And you know better than all of us that this is a region that doesn't trade together, that doesn't work together. And this is the time where we can harness the private sector, albeit it will be very difficult to bring some of these projects along, but to build those sort of connectivities.
Yeah, there is a moment now where there is this desire to start to build interconnectivities where we're no longer talking about the axis of resistance as being isolated from the rest. In Iraq and other countries, there is a desire to engage with Gulf and other partners. I think certainly creating more of these networks can dilute some of the kind of malign aspects to it and to create something that could be more sustainable and interconnected. The Iraqi government, for example, very much believes that its Development Road Initiative, which will connect Basra and the south of Iraq all the way north to Turkey and towards Europe, is something that is important. These types of initiatives, there's a big question as to whether they'll work or not, but there are initiatives out there. Connectivity is the key because this networks of networks is, especially in this multi-aligned context, going to be the standard operating procedure.
Renad Mansour, co-author of The Shape-Shifting Axis of Resistance. Sanam Vakil, thank you very much for joining us here at CSIS.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.